Cost sharing is a topic that you hear sort of from time to time, and you hear people sort of say, cost sharing is going away, we're not doing cost sharing anymore, or we're definitely doing more cost sharing than we expect to. And so I think it's important to think about the two sort of perspectives, because we hear about it coming and it going. So from the perspective of cost sharing coming and increasing, I think an obvious sort of element is federal budget constraints. We are all sort of facing increasing federal budget pressures, restrictions, and are trying to sort of challenge ourselves to figure out smarter or more creative ways to manage the sponsored funding that comes in and make sure that we're supporting it. So when you think about the budget constraints, that's definitely an area where you could say cost sharing is definitely coming as opposed to going. Hyper-competitive funding environments. So there's obviously, this connects to the federal budget constraints element, but connected to this as well, I think there's a persistent belief among faculty and sometimes even institutions more generally that cost sharing is going to increase a proposal's competitiveness. We'll talk about some of the elements associated with that later, but whether or not there is hard guidance or guidelines that tell you this does not actually increase the competitiveness of a proposal, that is going to continue to be a belief of faculty, especially when they're operating in a tighter and tighter environment. There can be the perception of institutions as wealthy. That I think is true in situations when you're talking about private institutions, but it can even be true in situations when you're talking about public institutions. And so I think this is something, that may be an easier push from a public institution to sort of say, hey, we do not have the sort of funding to support this. Private institutions sometimes have more of a challenge, but across the board, this is something that is a perception associated with cost sharing coming more frequently. There are, of course, relatively new regulations affecting sponsored programs, and some people might say uniform guidance isn't a new regulation, but I would say that it's still relatively new overall, and that changed the playing field in theory associated with cost sharing. There's the 26% cap on the A portion of F&A, which continues to be a topic of discussion, of course, right now. But the 26% cap is a sort of implicit cost sharing when you think about the fact that we can't recover. So that's more cost sharing, right? More funding coming from the institution. And then you have an increasing focus on the terms cost sharing versus institutional support, which we will also talk about later. But cost sharing versus institutional support is something that comes up from time to time. And what we've seen even before uniform guidance is agencies or various sponsors sort of taking away the terminology associated with cost sharing and then subbing in the term institutional support. And so institutional support tends to signal, an instance where you're not necessarily talking about dollar values of support, you're more talking about existing support in nouns and verbs maybe. But that idea of institutional support can often lead a faculty member or an institution to think, hey, let's get some more resources associated with this and put this forward. And those can sometimes need to be new outlays of new cash.